Thank you, Dame Rosie, and it's actually a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Middlesbrough. I'm going to pick up where he left off. The right to strike is neither absolute nor unlimited. He was quite correct to point us to the 87th Convention on the Freedom of Association and Protection of the Right to Organise, but he'll also be aware of Article 9 in that convention, which sets out the limited circumstances in which any member state has a margin for discretion to decide whether certain sectors can be banned from striking altogether. As a matter of fact, the United Kingdom does exercise that qualification. The UK restricts the right to strike for members of the police force, members of the armed forces and also prison officers. It's also right to say that despite what the honourable member said about, I think he used the language of having very restrictive union rights in this country, there has, and the opposition benches must concede this, been a high degree of consensus in government. And may I just gently remind him, after the numerous changes to strike law that were brought in the 1980s, when Labour got into government last, they published a white paper in 1998. It was entitled Fairness at Work, and I read from its forward. There will be no going back. The days of strikes without ballots, mass picketing, closed shops and secondary action are over. But where I do agree with him, I think, although I'll present it from a different angle, is that the issue in this bill and in this debate all the way through has been whether the restrictions that are proposed are necessary and proportionate. And I want to just start by touching on the amendments the honourable lady, who's not in her place anymore, and other members of the front bench have proposed, which are about removing, it's at amendments 9 to 14, paragraphs 9 to 14, and also 73 to 75, which seem to hack out each of the sectors which have been designated as sufficiently important to warrant a minimum service level, and they are, of course, education, transport, nuclear decommissioning, border security, fire and health. The honourable member for Middlesbrough was a tiny bit disingenuous when he read from the ILO's publication. He said the ILO only allows a minimum service level in, and I quote, I'm repeating him, in services the interruption of which would endanger the life, personal safety or health of the whole or part of the population. But he knows as well as I do that he could and should have read on, because they also say that they allow minimum service levels in services which are not essential in the strict sense of the term, but in which strikes of a certain magnitude and duration could cause acute crisis threatening the normal conditions of existence. And they give a third category where the public service is of fundamental importance. Now, earlier today, every member of this House received the House of Commons Library briefing on the minimum service level bill, and they included in that a really important report from the ILO, which I know many people will have read, and that was circulated to everybody this morning, and I'm going to read from it because they provide some assistance in that. It was in 2012 that they wrote this report. And what they said is the right to strike is not absolute. It may be restricted in exceptional circumstances or even prohibited altogether. And they gave 3 examples of where this applies. First of all, they talked about certain categories of public servants. And relevant to this debate, Dame Rosie, is where they talked about teachers. And they said the committee considers that public sector teachers are not included in the category of public servants exercising authority in the name of the state, and that therefore they should benefit from the right to strike, even though, under certain circumstances, we think that the maintenance of a minimum service should be envisaged. They went on, we think this principle should also apply to postal workers and to railway employees, as well as to civilian personnel in military institutions where they are not engaged in the provision of essential services in the strict sense of the term. So in relation to the NEU, who was going on strike on Wednesday, in relation to the RMT, who seems to be striking most of the time, the opposition knows, or at least it ought to know, that the ILO thinks that minimum service levels should apply both in education and in transport. Of course, I'll give way.
I'm very grateful for the honourable member for giving way, and she's making a very interesting contribution. Now, the government and the honourable member have been making out that the International Labour Organisation somehow supports this measure. However, the Director General of the International Labour Organisation says, and I quote, that he is, to quote, very worried about this piece of legislation. Given that, would the honourable member invite the Minister to withdraw this assertion that the ILO supports this measure when in fact they are on record as saying they're very worried about it?
Well, I thank the honourable member for his contribution. An experienced employment lawyer like the member for Middlesbrough will know very well what the true mechanics is, and that is that a union, probably the TUC, probably Professor Keith Ewing, because he did the last one, will put in a written submission about this to the ILO, and their committee of experts, who are based at the ILO office in Geneva, will in due course respond. And I don't think it's appropriate to say this is the complete answer of the ILO because somebody's waggled a microphone under someone's nose at Davos. There is a procedure for this. But I'm not suggesting, and I hope it's not confusing in my speech, I'm not suggesting for a moment that what I'm reading for, what was sent to MPs this morning, is a comment on the United Kingdom. It's a statement of general principles by the ILO on minimum service levels, and it's from that I'm going to continue, Dame Rosie, if I may. The ILO says the second acceptable restriction is where strikes take place in activities that could be considered to be essential services, and they list here air traffic control, telephone services. It's paragraph 135 of the report, if anyone would like to look it up, because it's on everybody's phone. Firefighting services, health and ambulance services, prison services, security and border services, water and electricity. And they say, in such situations where a total prohibition on strike action would not appear to be justified, consideration needs to be given to ensuring that users' basic needs are met, or that facilities operate safely or without interruption, so the introduction of negotiated minimum services could be appropriate. So I will give way on that point.
Very interesting what she's saying, but does she accept that, as we are in Europe, any analysis of the legality of these proposals has to start with the ECHR and Article 11 of the ECHR? And I wonder if she's going to come on and address that. And can she also answer me this question? Can she point to any country in Europe that has government-enforced minimum standards which can lead to the sacking of workers on strike? Listen to the question carefully, because the answer is going to be in the record, Minister. Can she point to any other country in Europe that has government-enforced minimum standards without negotiation, without arbitration?
The Honourable Lady is trying to catch my eye later, and I am. I don't want interventions to be too long. Well, yes, I know. I was going to say it's quite important that interventions aren't interrupted. Has the Honourable Lady finished very briefly? Yes.
This. Can the Honourable Lady point me to any country in Europe where, as a result of government-enforced minimum standards, without any negotiation and without any arbitration, a worker can lose his or her job, other than, wait for it, Hungary or Russia?
So I'm going to respond to the Honourable Lady. Absolutely right, it requires negotiation. I was actually shocked to find that in France, if you refuse a requisitioning request, the sanction is in the criminal courts. I didn't know that. I didn't know that was the case in Canada either. It may be that I've misread the legislation, actually. It may be that that was a life and limb exemption. I'm not familiar with French legislation enough. Well, OK, I'm going to move on, because I just... no, I've given the examples of France or Canada, which, as I've said, have more...
Help me, Honourable Member. Thank you for giving way. Is she also aware that the ILO are saying that unions should participate in defining minimum service levels, and any dispute shouldn't be dealt with by government but by an independent body? Does she agree that it's not in the bill?
I do agree with the Honourable Member on that, actually, and I would like to come on to that point because I think it's a good one. So, even though the ILO has set out in black and white the service where they say the right to strike might be lawfully restricted, even though the list that they have given includes every single one that the government has got in this bill, in fact the ILO go much further than this, despite that, the opposition for some reason seems to wish to take out every single one of those essential services. So that must be no to a minimum service level when the schools are on strike, no to any key worker being able to put their kids in school, or no to any vulnerable child being able to be looked after, no to the trains running at all during the rush hours. I do think that the opposition need to be clear with the British people as to why they say their amendment should deviate so far from international norms. Because it seems to be the case that, in their view, the country should grind to a standstill. But I want to come, I actually will make a bit of progress because I'm very conscious. Am I over time already, Dame Rosie? Can I just deal then really briefly with the issue of sanction, because it's come up. And the honourable member for Middlesbrough particularly, I only say this because I know he's an employment lawyer, there may be others, but he will know that Section 219 of the 1992 Act is particularly uniquely convoluted in the way it confers a protection on the worker and on the union in terms of the right to strike. So the statutory language is that there is immunity in suit from the tort of inducement to breach of contract. That is the right to strike as expressed in domestic law. And what I think that the law is doing in terms of sanction here is removing the immunity. That is what's happening. And that is the logical consequence of anything which restricts the right to strike. Now, I just want to say this. Nobody in this chamber envisages sacking nurses or any other category of emergency workers. But it must be right that if the Section 219 immunity is lost or in any way qualified, then you bring into play disciplinary sanctions. That must be right, and I accept that. And I've said already in response to the Honourable Lady, both France and Canada seem to have actually a far more draconian system. I was surprised to read it this afternoon. OK, well, she can correct the House when she makes her speech. But the one thing I would say is, again, I looked at what the ILO said, and what they said about this issue is this, and I'll finish here, Dame Rosie, because I'm being annoying, I can tell. If the strike is determined to be unlawful by a competent judicial authority on the basis of provisions that are in conformity with the freedom of association principles, then proportionate disciplinary sanctions may be imposed. I do have some improvements, I think, that could be made to the bill, but I'm going to take them offline and say them afterwards.